Hello, everyone. I've been wanting to make this video for a long time since I have noticed there is very little information or resources about the historical development of chalices or a comprehensive survey of the types of chalices that exist, as well as the symbolism of what the chalice means in traditional Christianity. So I'm glad to share this overview with you all that I put together. And it took me a few years to do this, and I hope you it will help you to identify different styles of chalices you may come across, as well as the deeper symbolic importance of chalices and the narrative role that they fulfill. So to begin, we have to talk about what is the chalice itself in a narrative sense, and what role does it play in human experience. So, in popular culture today, you may hear about a chalice or the word chalice very infrequently, but it appears nonetheless in our collective narrative in several ways. First of all, the chalice is often associated with King Arthur and the many, many stories that surround King Arthur and the Holy Grail. Um, and related to that is the popular Indiana Jones film. In all of these versions, the basic story is that the Grail has been lost, and a few heroes are searching for it. Another place where the chalice appears might surprise you. In many sporting events, the symbol of victory is called a trophy, but it is actually a drinking cup, a chalice. For the most prestigious competitions, the trophy is even made of precious metals like silver or gold. Often in the ceremony after a race, the winner drinks something from the trophy. And this is actually a ritual act of refreshment. You can see that the trophy plays into the pattern of the grail. Although many search for it, only one finds it and may drink from it. It refreshes him, and it becomes the sign of his victory. And this is the pattern of the cup, that valuable vessel that refreshes you with a good drink. So, when considering the symbolism of the cup, it's important to realize that there are various levels of cups, but they all follow the basic pattern of refreshment. The most mundane version of this is the disposable cup, and usually it's made of disposable materials like paper or thin plastic, and you use them and then throw them away. But probably you have at home several sturdier cups that you use on a daily basis. You wash them, you dry them, you keep them in a cabinet. These might be made of metal or ceramic or thick plastic. You don't just throw these away after using them one time. Then, going up the ladder, you might have a few special cups that you use only on special occasions. Maybe these were gifts from someone you love or heirlooms from grandparents. Those you would want to take special care of and perhaps even keep them out of reach. So then the question is, what's at the top of this hierarchy of cups? What is the most precious of cups? And that is exactly what we're talking about here today. To understand what a chalice is, you need to see that it is the highest possible cup of refreshment. That is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. Now, why is this the highest cup? It's because this is the cup that holds the highest mystery, the highest refreshment, the highest um, substance, right? The highest mystery of God Himself. The story around this cup is of the highest and greatest reverence. Christ Himself promises eternal life to those who drink this cup, which contains His own body and blood. By definition, everlasting life is the highest refreshment. So you cannot go any higher than that in the domain of cups. So let's take a look now at some of the earliest depictions of chalices in iconography. And we have a very stable pattern of the Last Supper depicted around a half round table. This pattern is amazingly stable, and it even appears in the earliest depictions, such as the third century um, wall paintings in the catacombs of St. Callistus in Rome. There are generally several vessels depicted in this prototype. You have occasionally a large central vessel, such as in the manuscript miniature in the Rosano Gospels. Occasionally, as in the 6th century mosaic from Ravenna, there's a tray of fish, from which we get the Old English word grail. Rarely we see what we can identify as a central chalice, as in the manuscript miniature on the top right from the Gospel of St. Augustine in Cambridge. It may appear that the differences between these are arbitrary, but they actually symbolize the hidden nature of the chalice. The fish are a reference to Christ's miracle of the 5 loaves and 2 fish. The artists are placing a veil over what is happening in the scene to preserve the sacred mystery. So now we can summarize a few things about the chalice. A chalice is a ceremonial cup, often made of precious metals, particularly used in Christian churches over the last 2,000 years. But it's based on Greco-Roman models of the chalices and the cantaros, which was used throughout the time of Christ in the Greco-Roman world. And the chalice is the pinnacle of Christian liturgical objects associated with the central rite of the Eucharist. So how's it used? The chalice is used primarily by the priest during the sacred liturgy, which is the most solemn ceremony in the traditional Christian churches. And the chalice contains the consecrated wine, the consecrated bread as well. The minister offers the chalice to God on the altar and then administers the sacred contents to the people in attendance. So now you can see there's some movements happening through the chalice, right? There's a flow. So first, the people are working the earth and they bring bread and wine to church. The priest puts it in the sacred vessel and offers them up to God in heaven, right? That's the movement from earth, from below to above, to heaven. Then God comes down from heaven into the chalice. Then, by the hands of the sacred ministers, God is distributed to the people in the church, right? There's the downward movement from heaven into earth. And this is the traditional Christian understanding of what a chalice is. It's the meeting point of heaven and earth. The chalice is the highest way of how we maintain contact with God and Him with us. That is the first sense, the first reason why we call it communion. It is communion with God first, with heaven itself, as well as our neighbors and all of the earth. All of heaven and earth come together in the chalice, and we participate in that. So to bring all of this symbolism together, now you may start to see how the pattern of the sacred vessel is a fractal, or it's like Russian nesting dolls. And this icon right here is amazing at layering all these patterns into one single image. You have God in the middle, and He's coming out of the chalice. And the chalice is on the altar table of the church. And then you have that within the temple building itself. And then you have the Blessed Mother of God herself encompassing all of that. And this is why the Mother of God symbolizes the mystical body of Christ, the whole church, and even paradise itself, the walled garden where God dwells. Okay, now that we can see what the chalice is, let's turn to the historical periods and the styles of chalices. So, first thing to realize, the history of chalices is part of art history in general. Just as there are Gothic cathedrals, there are Gothic chalices. Baroque churches, in turn, housed Baroque chalices. The people of every age seem to desire for their chalices to match their architecture. And as I mentioned earlier, the symbolism of the chalice and the symbolism of the church building or temple is very closely related, since both of them serve as containers that mediate the union of heaven and earth. So, based in Greco Roman prototypes, the Christian chalice grew and developed into various forms over the past 2,000 years. But there are some trajectories that we're going to draw out and notice. There's some meaning that is conveyed in the forms that the chalice grew to take. In general, the chalice has grown taller, and the bowl or cup has narrowed, and there are details that were present in the Greco-Roman prototypes which over time became more pronounced, such as the knob and the stem. In the Greco-Roman vessels, the knob appears as a slight bulge, if present at all, and located under the cup. However, as the centuries progressed, the knob tended to grow in size and become richly ornamented in time. And over centuries, the knob became a feature of chalices that allowed the priest to grip the vessel at a lower center of gravity, thus facilitating the elevation of the chalice during consecration. So that was an overview, and now we're going to look at the main periods one by one. First thing to look at is the Greco-Roman vessels. So during the first centuries of Christian worship, the clergy and laity were severely persecuted by the Romans and other groups, and they used the best vessels they had available to them at the time. The two types of vessels that were common in the Greco-Roman world were the cantharos with handles and the calices, the long stem. Unfortunately, we have very few, if any, that can be positively identified as Christian chalices from this period. Undoubtedly, when Christianity became legalized with Emperor Constantine, the specialized creation of chalices would have begun in earnest. We know from mosaics and frescoes from the time that the chalices in use were derived from these two forms. So once Christianity is legalized, then you have the appearance of precious chalices, and we call these late Roman chalices. And these are extremely rare due to their age. What we know of them is mostly from mosaics from the period, such as those in Ravenna. And many of these chalices were undoubtedly melted down in preceding centuries to create new vessels or even coinage, or they were stolen in raids by barbarians. The prime surviving example of this period is the Cordon chalice, which is found near Poitiers in France. This example is a descendant of the Cantados family of chalices, which includes those two handles on the cup. The ornament, however, is decidedly what you could call barbarian, including the same motifs and techniques like granulation and enamel that are found in other works like the Merovingian works and the Northern Germanic pagan pieces. There are liturgical books from this period that describe the two-handled chalice as the vessel from which the lay people drank during the sacred liturgy. It makes sense, something for people to grip on as they partake. And this chalice, like the architecture and art from this period, is an important continuation from the Roman past while also integrating with the Northern Germanic peoples. Another key style and period you can call as a whole the Byzantine chalices, or these maybe you can call them the early Byzantine chalices. These are characterized by a deep bowl-like cup set on a narrow stem and slightly flared foot, kind of like a trumpet. Often, ornamentation includes a series of arches over saints around the bowl. Some Byzantine chalices make use of ancient stone vessels or bowls, such as the Romanos chalice. And these chalices are extremely rare due to the Arabian invasions during this period. And some notable examples are um, like the Ataruthi chalices. These have been found in buried places, presumably to save them from raids. These chalices evoke solidity, wide columns, and devotion to the saints, clearly. The Ethiopic traditions of Africa, while all this was happening in Europe, they maintained a form of the chalice that stayed very consistent over the centuries. It diverged only very slightly from the Greco Roman chalice, which had the longer stem. They tend to include a wide mouthed bowl like cup with a lip, a tall cylindrical stem, and a foot that's almost flat. The key example of this style is the Magdala chalice. It is significant that the chalices do not seem to have included major ornamentation, or very few. Perhaps this is in keeping with the architectural pattern of Ethiopian churches, which do not tend to display great ornamentation on the outside, instead, saving the decoration for the inside. The fact that the Ethiopian chalices resemble the calics so closely, to me, is indicative of the Ethiopians' ability to preserve aspects of tradition that have elsewhere developed in a different direction, but in Ethiopia they are preserved, much like their preservation of manuscripts such as the Book of Enoch. Let's look at uh, the next period here, which is lumped together under the term of pre-Romanesque. It's really a catch-all term that encompasses all the art after the fall of Rome and before the 11th century. So included here are the Anglo-Saxon styles, the Visigothic styles, Merovingian styles, and Carolingian styles of chalices too. They're all very similar. Despite local variations, there are patterns that can be easily identified. The first thing to notice is the silhouette of the chalice, which tends to resemble an hourglass. It's almost symmetrical um, in its form. Looking at the large knob in the middle, that's another key feature to the style. For ornamentation, there are often examples of granulation, which is little um, spheres of silver or gold that are soldered in place, or filigree, which is wire soldered in place to make patterns. Sometimes precious stones, and often engravings. The key example of this period is the Tassilo chalice, which was made by Anglo-Saxon artisans on the continent in the 8th century. Today, it remains one of the most popular prototypes of a chalice, and its beautiful sacred images inspire devotion. A key thing about the pre-Romanesque here is that it's continuing the merging of the Roman patterns and the northern barbarian patterns into one coherent expression. So insular art is sometimes grouped under pre-Romanesque, but I like to look at it separately because it's so significant. So, like the Anglo-Saxon chalices, the insular examples tend to have the hourglass shape, but unlike them, they display exquisite ornamentation in granulation, stones, and enamels. So the art that you would find in insular manuscripts like the Book of Kells is found here too on these chalices. You will see the same spiraling, interweaving motifs of animals and people in silver and gold. The key examples of this style are the Ardagh chalice and the Derrynafon chalice. In relation to architecture, we have very few, if any, church buildings that remain from this period because many were constructed in wood, which were vulnerable to raids. A few small churches like St. Magdara's Church in Galway survive, and they give us a tantalizing glimpse of what early Irish churches even the wooden ones may have looked like. But now it's devoid of any interior decoration. And so the artistry of the insular tradition had a huge impact on the continent, and it definitely influenced the other styles, the Carolingians, the Merovingians, and it paved the way to what came next, which is the Romanesque. And the Romanesque style is huge. It was much more than anything that came before. It was an international artistic movement, and it integrated all of the minor regional styles into one thrust, right? So, from the Anglo Saxons and the barbarians, it incorporated the large spherical knob that had developed and the sense of the hourglass symmetry. From the Byzantines through the Merovingians and Carolingians, it incorporated the wide bowl like cup and the lavish ornamentation, which included granulation, filigree, precious stones, and engravings. And overall, the Romanesque chalices give the impression of solidity, wideness, and this grandeur. The accompanying architecture and art demonstrate the same themes, including Roman arches, very blocky construction silhouettes, um, and it definitely continued the traditional Christian symbolism and the emphasis on the narrative in its art. Romanesque sculpture also demonstrates that inclination to decorate everything with a sacred meaning. Even the tops of columns were decorated with narrative scenes. So it's definitely, when you think of Romanesque, the Saint Remy chalice here is the predominant example of Romanesque chalice. After the Romanesque, an amazing artistic movement swept through Europe, known as the Gothic period. And the Gothic chalices represent a big leap from their Romanesque predecessors in several ways, right? They're taller, they're more pointy, and they come in more variety of ornamentation and outlines. They continued the reach upwards that the Romanesque even started to do by elongating the stem both below and above the knob. And this allowed the chalice to gain height. And instead of a vertical trumpet shaped foot like their predecessors, Gothic chalices often had lobed feet or segmented um, um, in sixes or in eights of lobes. This broke up the perfect circle into sections of a circle. Instead of a spherical knob, as in the Romanesque, the Gothic chalices often had architectural models of churches built in or tower into the knob. On the other hand, they also featured medallions like the Romanesque ones, but instead, the Gothic medallions project further out from the knob into space, and the cup itself is often funnel shaped and smaller in volume than Romanesque cups. Like the Gothic architecture and manuscript art, chalices sought to articulate the implications of geometry. This is a key thing about the Gothic mentality, right? And you can understand this by looking at the lobed foot of the chalice, for example. So inside of a circle, there are many implicit points in the circle. The Gothic geometry seeks to express those hidden points, and this is manifested in the foot of the chalice, which develop these lobes. And in the same way, the Gothic arch is another good example. It's an articulation of the Roman arch by emphasizing the top midpoint of that arch. The result is that Gothic chalices and art tend to be prickly, pointed, elongated, elegantly tall, and stretching towards heaven in a way. So after the Gothic period, um, we have many different styles, but I've grouped them together here and to make it simple and call them the Plateresque style. It's predominantly associated with Spanish art and architecture, but I've included it here as a broader category, which would include Florentine and other Renaissance styles as well. They all have in common a love for the vase, which is this is a good indicator for this period of chalices. So the knop, which in previous periods were spherical or architectural, now has been elongated, and it's this vase shape or an egg looking shape. In addition to that, there is a highly domed foot. So the base of the chalice is kind of like inflated, almost like a mushroom. It's a high domed. These two features are key to Plateresque chalices. There is ornament, but it is primarily by way of engravings and chasings. Sometimes bells are attached to the chalice by little chains as well. This is the first time in the history of chalices that sacred images of saints and Christ seem to be de emphasized, almost disappear from the chalices. The emphasis instead is on the curves and the outline of the chalices. From a technical perspective, it seems to me that the metal spinning lathe technique was used widely during this period on the chalices, perhaps for the first time at this wide scale. This enabled the creation of symmetrical, rounded forms, such as characterize these chalices here. And like its accompanying architecture and art, these chalices invoke a sense of refinement, classical simplicity, and yet also rooted in the lived experience, the physical world. Right? They tend to de-emphasize the mysterious, symbolic aspects, and as well as the figurative art that came before it, and instead emphasize floral elements, nature, or even abstract patterns. So in my opinion, Rococo is really an elaboration of Baroque, so I merged them together here. The key to recognizing one of these chalices is to look for the elevated or highly domed foot. This was an ingenious way to give more height to the chalice and still maintain stable proportions. It gives the impression of stability and of grandeur. Often, Baroque chalices are highly ornate with floral patterns, a decorated subcup, which is the section below the let's say the bowl of the cup, um, and it also will include intricate chasing typically. However, they do not enjoy um, the earlier ornamentation styles like engraving stones, granulations. And this produced an emphasis on the sculptural or the figurative forms of ornamentation, much like Baroque sculpture and architecture and art emphasize the massive sculptural aspects of art. So while that was going on in Western Europe, the Russian style of chalices really grabbed onto the Baroque tendency, and they continued its development. So these sacred vessels retained the kind of bulbous domed foot and the vase-like central knob, and as well as a tall stature, which all characterized the Baroque. But they added more icons. They enlarged the cup. In addition, the Russian chalices can be quite huge as an object, sometimes requiring two hands to hold. It's very fitting with the onion domes and the ornate manuscripts. These chalices typically enjoy the same rich ornamentation and colorful details, and even famously including floral enamels. So, in the 19th century, a very strange thing happened to the development of the chalice. Instead of further developing the traditions received from the immediate past, artists looked to the more distant past. They began to create pieces that imitate and at sometimes even perfect the styles of historic chalices. And one of the early leaders, and perhaps the best, was Augustin Pujon, which is the father of English Gothic revival. And following the Gothic revival came the arts and crafts movement, the neo Romanesque style, the neo Baroque. And the reason for this looking backward, I believe, has to do with the fatigue of the Industrial Revolution that was in full strength by this time in the mid 19th century. In the face of the dehumanizing industrial climate, they were looking to connect with something ancient and meaningful. So they looked to the past masterpieces. However, the revivalist movements called for an equal and opposite reaction. So instead of looking backward, the next couple generations became proponents largely of modernism, and they were urging artists to look forward. Um, Unfortunately, they de emphasized the spirit of continuity and focused on a drive towards novelty and originality. The appearance of the modernist style of chalices signals a major change in the history of liturgical art. Unlike other movements in the past, the modern chalice has a split personality. It typically appears either in its minimalist form or its rough form. The rough form retains things like the hammer marks or the appearance of cracks or stone texture, which are things that historic chalices carefully avoided uh, doing. The rough form flaunts the imperfections that would have made traditional silversmiths and goldsmiths cringe. It calls attention to the materials. That's what it's doing. On the other hand, the minimalist form is unblemished in its polished surfaces, but it's devoid of ornament or sacred images. It's like a blank silhouette of a chalice. And so, taken together, you can see the modern chalice appears as something like a reset. It's searching for meaning, but both these styles fit with the architecture and art of the modern movement, which likewise de emphasize ornament, borders, upward motion, preferring instead abstraction of the human form and abstraction of architectural forms, as well as abstraction of sacred images. So, what comes next? I'm not really sure. The postmodern or the postmodern period that we're in right now. It's kind of at a crossroad. We have all of the revivalist movements of the past century or two are still in full swing. You can go online and buy any uh, Gothic style chalice, but it's made to look like a Gothic chalice, or is not. It actually is not from the Gothic period. That sort of thing is, I think, also unique to the history of chalices. I don't think there was a time when the Gothic artisan said, "You know what? Let's make a, Greco-Roman style cantados." I don't think it happened. I don't think they were doing that. What they were doing was receiving the traditions from the immediate predecessors and developing that, either continuing it as is or developing it slightly along theological lines or cultural lines as well. So looking forward to the postmodern, the post-postmodern, what's coming up next? Um, it seems like what's likely to happen is a more of the same, which is the reaction to the modern abstraction will probably produce a um an insistence on traditional forms on one hand, as well as the continuation of the abstraction on the other hand. So I think the different streams will likely continue until and unless a major artistic, philosophical, religious shift happens, which will spur on a new movement, much like the Gothic movement sprouted out of the Romanesque, or the Baroque sprouted out of the Plateresque Renaissance period. So we're at a crossroads, to be sure. So thank you for joining me on this overview of the historical development of chalices. I hope you enjoyed it and can now see the continuity and change of these sacred vessels over the centuries. And I hope now, next time you see a chalice, you can identify the style next time you're in church. Thank you so much. It's been really great to make this video, and I hope it helps. And thanks for watching.